Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Missouri Prairie Foundation's webinar, Monarch Conservation, Opportunities and Challenges with Dr. Kristen Baum. My name is Carol David. I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar today. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your screen. You should be able to see a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. At the end of Dr. Baum's presentation, Missouri Prairie Foundation Conservation Program Associate Lily Germeroth, who has studied monarch habitat needs as a topic of her master's thesis, will read your questions out to Dr. Baum. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. And now for some background on our presenter. Dr. Kristen Baum is the Director of Monarch Watch, Senior Scientist with the Kansas Biological Survey and Center for Ecological Research, and a Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. She has worked with, prior to her assuming the role of Monarch Watch Director in 2023, Dr. Baum was a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology and Associate Dean for Research at the College of Arts and Sciences at Oklahoma State University. Dr. Baum has worked with monarchs and pollinating insects in the Great Plains for more than 25 years. Her monarch research focuses on the effects of land use and management practices on the distribution and abundance of monarchs, milkweeds, and monarch parasite interactions. She also has a long-term project focusing on the wing size, body weight, sex ratio, and OE monarch parasite infection status of fall migrants in Oklahoma. Dr. Baum has served on numerous state, regional, and national working groups to support conservation efforts for monarchs and other pollinators. We are honored to have Dr. Baum here with us today. Please take it away, Dr. Baum.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks everyone for joining us. So I'm going to talk today about opportunities and challenges associated with monarch conservation. So to start, just to give some background on monarchs, and since we're nearing the fall migration, we'll start from the perspective of the fall. So as we go a little bit farther into August, we'll start seeing the fall migration start. So thinking of the monarchs that are in the upper Midwest and southern Canada, those monarchs will fly south and reach the overwintering sites in central Mexico at the end of October, early November. They'll spend the winter there, and then come spring, those same individuals that migrated south will make the flight back north. They'll reach Texas and lay eggs, and that will be the first generation of monarchs that then will start that cycle over. So then those adults will emerge and move farther north, and we will see monarchs in this region of the country for that second generation. So thinking about some of the challenges for monarchs, many of you have probably seen this graph before. So the lowest population size for monarchs was recorded for the overwintering season of 2013-14. So that's down here. And then our most recent overwintering season was the second lowest on record at 0.9 hectares. So if we think about how do you figure out how many monarchs there are, that can be challenging. So on the overwintering sites, what they'll do is they'll go to the known sanctuaries where monarchs form colonies over the winter. They'll identify the tree that's farthest upslope that's occupied by monarchs, and then they'll measure the distance and direction to all the trees around the periphery of that colony, add up all the colonies, and that's how we come up with a number of hectares of monarchs, which is always an interesting way to think of looking at it. And so there's been research to try to figure out how many monarchs there are per hectare, and depending on the project, they've came up with different estimates. And the most recent research on that. They've kind of combined all the previous estimates, looked at the limitations and constraints, and came up with this 21.1 million monarchs per hectare. So again, there was a little less than a hectare this past overwintering season. So if we think about some of the factors that have contributed to the decline that we've seen in the monarch population, loss of habitat, and in particular, loss of milkweed would be one of the biggest contributing factors. So that would be due to crop production, and in particular, Roundup Ready corn and soybeans, also urbanization and other types of development, and other factors as well. So climate would be another big one. This is from the drought monitor that shows drought conditions throughout the US down into Mexico. And I pulled these graphs from the migration season of last year. And so if you look at these, the dark red represents exceptional drought. Red is extreme drought. And then as you move up into the yellow colors, that's kind of abnormally dry. So if we think about the fall monarch migration and monarchs moving south, kind of funneling down through southern Oklahoma, Texas, down through to central Mexico, we can see it looks like a pretty extensive drought in 2023. So poor conditions. Usually we don't worry a whole lot about nectar. When we think about the fall migration, we think, oh, they'll find something. But when you have conditions that cover most of the southern portion of the migration route, that can certainly be challenging. And 2023 was somewhat of a unique year in that it did extend all the way from southern Oklahoma down to where the overwintering sites were. So other years where we've had drought conditions, it might be that conditions are better once they reach, some portions of Mexico, so they're able to fuel up, gain back some of that nectar. So they need the nectar both for making that migration, but then also storing up lipids, fats that will get them through the winter, and then the spring migration as well. So climate being very important for monarchs as well. And so thinking more about habitat loss and where we can add milkweed to the landscape, that map on the left represents the protected areas. So public land where there could be habitat for monarchs. So if we think about the monarch migration and the eastern monarch population. So those are the monarchs that are east of the Rockies, east of the Continental Divide, all the way across through to the East Coast. You can see there's not much in terms of protected areas. So, needing to rely on public lands to be able to add that milkweed to the landscape. So then if we look at the cropscape data layer, which is the map to the right, that shows data that's compiled by the National Agricultural Statistics Service every year on what crops are produced where. And so if we look at that kind of central region where most of our monarch production is, we can see a lot of yellow and dark green. So that represents the corn and soybean production. So, again, crops occupying a lot of that landscape. And again, the need to think about how can we add milkweed to the landscape in these private lands and croplands and other types of habitats. So if we go back to this graph of the population decline, I wanted to kind of add Monarch Watch into that conversation. So data were first recorded using kind of these standardized methods for the overwintering season of 1994 and 95. Monarch Watch was founded by Dr. Chip Taylor in 1992, so prior to this graph, so off the graph to the left. And it originally started with the tagging program. So, and we'll talk about tagging in a little bit, but tagging and then the education piece that goes along with that, thinking about, working with schools and kids and the opportunity to see the life cycle. Those were other pieces that kind of fit with the tagging and the education efforts of Monarch Watch. And so more recently, we focused a lot on habitat for monarchs. So the Monarch Way Station program was started in 2005. And you can look at the graph and you can see as well that overwintering season of 2004, 2005, at the time was the lowest on record. So identifying the need for creating more habitat, and I'm going to talk more about Monarch Way Stations in a minute, but that kind of shifts the focus a lot to also including that on the ground conservation efforts. And then Monarch Watch started distributing milkweed in 2013. So again, continuing that on the ground conservation effort. And that focused a lot, if we think back to 2013, there was not a lot of production of, it was harder to find native plants at nurseries. Milkweed had some challenges with germination. And so they're finding milkweed, even more so, was challenging. And so focusing a lot on those really early efforts to get milkweed production increased. And so I'll focus on some of those activities as well. So I'm going to actually start and focus more on way stations and then shift to tagging as we move on. So this shows our current map of way stations in the US. So we've got over 48,000 registered way stations. And again, the program started in 2005. And Jim just created this map for us at the end of July. So it shows what the current distribution looks like. But we've also got way stations in 12 other countries and territories worldwide, including countries that don't have monarchs. So kind of the idea and the concept of providing habitat for monarchs, other pollinators, has really been important to a lot of people. So that kind of brings up the question, what is a monarch way station and how does one create one? So this is a picture of Monarch Way Station number 1, which is located adjacent to our building on the KU campus in Lawrence. And this is one little small snapshot, very small area of the garden from, I think it was last week. It was very, very recent. And it's interesting, you go out in the garden and it changes it from week to week, depending on what's blooming. And it's grown a lot over the years. And it's a collaborative effort with the Douglas County Master Gardeners. And so they come every week, spend lots of time. So if you ever want to stop by, we had people stop by a weekend or so ago that were wanting to find out what plants were blooming, to see what they might want to add to their habitat as well. But always lots of great things to see. So if we think about what to include in a Monarch Way Station, so any size will work, but ideally you've got a good bit of space, so 100 square feet or more. Most of our good pollinator plants are sun. It's harder to come by shade plants. There are some that are good, but so a sunny location is always helpful. Good drainage, hit or miss, depending on where you live. Then creating some shelter, so providing plants that are more dense than what you might see in a typical kind of well-managed home garden space. So a little bit more dense, but not crowded. And then adding in the milkweed and the nectar. So when we think about milkweed plants, anybody that's reared any caterpillars, watch them either in their garden or their home, know that when they get to that 5th instar stage, they're going to eat a lot. So providing adequate number of plants, so 10 or more plants, ideally 2 or more species. And so the idea behind that would be, depending on the year, one species might be doing better than another. So it's nice to have a variety as well. Milkweed is also a great nectar plant. And from my previous research, actually on native bees at some rangeland sites, it's one of the most used nectar plants, or the most used nectar plant, actually in May and June. So it's a great nectar source for lots of other pollinators. Lots of other wildlife use different parts of milkweed plants. You can think of birds using the fluff from the milkweed seed pods to build nests and things like that. So great great for many other things. In terms of nectar plants, wanting to make sure you have plants that bloom over that whole growing season. So having some annuals and some perennials, and again, making sure you're covering spring to fall with an emphasis on providing nectar for that fall migration. So making sure you cover that full range of blooming activity. And then, of course, don't use insecticides. And then, depending on where your way station is located, you might need to do other things in terms of, backyard versus front yard, and personal preference. So, thinning, mulching, water, all of those things may or may not be needed, depending on your goals. And then making sure to add in other features to support education, other pollinators or wildlife. And again, there's lots of things you can do. Many of our good nectar plants also are good for stem nesting bees. So if you cut back your plants in the fall, leave them through the next growing season, the next winter, they might be used as by native bees for nesting as well. So lots of options for way stations, and thinking about other opportunities to provide habitat for monarchs. We have 2 free milkweed programs that we run at Monarch Watch. We also have our milkweed market, so you can connect to different nurseries and buy milkweed as well for your personal use. We have sometimes people that are buying and sharing. They kind of go in and buy a couple flats and share with neighbors, or use for events, etc. But we'll open up our free milkweed programs towards the end of this year, and there's 2 opportunities. We have our free milkweeds for restoration program. So for that one, it's focused on more natural native types of habitats. So not home gardens. So you would typically have 2 acres or more. You'd want to have some type of land management plan in place to maintain that habitat after you've added your milkweed. And then thinking about needing to have the overall habitat, you would also need some nectar sources, which you may already have, or maybe that's something you would be adding as well. So that program is available. And then we also have our free milkweeds for schools and nonprofits program. And that one, focuses on educational goals, maintenance plan, having a suitable space, adding in that nectar piece as well. And then since we're focusing on school grounds for that one, making sure you've got support to be able to have that habitat in place for years to come. So those are some of the programs that we have. And I thought I would share some, kind of background to that as well. So if you've ever gone on the milkweed market, you've probably noticed the focus on ecoregions. And so our goal is to grow milkweed plants from seed collected in these different ecoregions, and then send those plants back to that ecoregion. So again, wanting the plants to be from seed that's adapted and suitable for that location. And we actually have a pilot program that we're trying this fall that is for ecoregion 255. So that would be kind of this east central Texas, this mustard yellow color extending up into south central Oklahoma. And so we do have some milkweed that's going to be available this fall for fall planting. So we've typically focused on spring planting, but if you happen to be in that area and want to try fall planting, we will have some milkweed available for that ecoregion 255 for this fall. And so we rely a lot on volunteers for all aspects of Monarch Watch. I will say volunteers make the world go round. We have lots of dedicated volunteers that make everything at Monarch Watch happen. And so we have volunteers that will go out and collect seed from these different ecoregions and send it to us. And there's a few times where there might be an ecoregion. So for example, in our local area where we tend to not get much seed for a species that we like to grow. So this is a low growing milkweed. There's a picture over on the right-hand side, Asclepias viridis. It's the one I've spent most of my life looking at. But here we have actually our Monarch Watch team. So Ann, Dina, and Casey are out there collecting milkweed seed pods. We did this earlier this year. I was in the background. Later on, you can see how it looks very wet and dewy, overcast. I have a nice video of me dumping dew out of my boots, which was a large amount of water there. But so we do some seed collections as well, but are really grateful for all the seed that we get sent, that we then send to nurseries to grow out for planting. So this would be one of our nurseries, and all the milkweed that's being grown for distribution this past spring. And then you can see what some of the plants look like when they were sent out for distribution. So lots of growing of milkweed to get plants in the ground. And so now I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about tagging, and another kind of emphasis on our volunteers. We have volunteers that come and get these tagging kits ready to send out to everyone. And this image is from the Monarch Watch shop, which is where you can go and order a tagging kit, and we're processing those every week. So if you haven't ordered tags yet and you're interested in tagging, you can go order a kit. This will be the first year that the tagging newsletter is written by me. So this is one from, I think, 2019. So we have Chip there, but you can see what you get in your tagging kit. You've got a newsletter that talks about tagging and the population, things like that. You get a data sheet, but we've also got other options for ways you can submit data in terms of an app that you can use on your mobile device, or an Excel spreadsheet, so other formats as well. And then, of course, we've got our tags pictured in the top center there. So a question that we're getting frequently these days is, well, one, when do I need to order my tags by? So if you haven't ordered yet, get your order in, and we'll be shipping those out as quickly as we can. But we also base it on when should you begin tagging. So if you look at this map, it has the latitudes highlighted here. So you would want to identify, what latitude your location is at. So if we'll just look at 40 north, kind of for kind of north Kansas and Missouri. So then you would go over to the table, and this is also on the shop website, in the Monarch Watch website. But you can see you would begin tagging around August 21st, and the goal there is to make sure you're getting the migratory generation and not the last breeding generation, so that you're getting adults that are going to be migrating. And then the other question that we frequently get, is when can I expect to see the most activity? So for example, if you're planning a tagging event, when would that best be timed? So you can also look on our website, and if we kind of guesstimate here for latitude 40, the midpoint of the migration would be between September 16th and 22nd. And then we've got, kind of a range of peak dates. And our tagging event that we have in Lawrence, over at the Baker Wetlands, is actually scheduled for September 21st this year. So that would also give you an idea when you might expect to see a good bit of monarch activity. And another good resource for finding out what others are seeing is Journey North. So Journey North is a community science project where you submit observations. So we also rely on Journey North information and participants a lot in the spring. So you can submit your first monarch, your first milkweed, your first egg, all the different life stages. But for the fall migration, you can also submit when you're seeing peak migration. So when you're seeing the most activity, so you can see this is from last year, because we're not there yet for this year. But you can see the dots with the white center represent those with photos. So you can click on those and actually see what people are observing. So that can give you an idea too of what does activity look like in your area, and then you can submit your observations as well. And then there's also where you can submit fall roost activity. So that would be where monarchs are aggregating, in trees during the fall migration. And again, you can click on those dots with the white center to see pictures of what that looks like. And so that would also help you track what it's looking like this fall. So if you look at our tagging app, this shows some of the information on there. This image here is the one that shows how you can submit your tagging data. So you can actually scan in your tagging, your sheet of tags. If you want to populate the tag code field automatically, location, and then you can either submit your data if you've got a good connection, or if you want to save it and submit later, you can do that as well. And you can also keep a log of your data. There's also a place in the app where you can submit observations. So we'll talk a little bit about tag recoveries in a minute, but you can also report, I guess we would call them domestic observations during the fall. So maybe you are tagging monarchs and you see a live tagged one that you get a picture of, or you get the code written down for. You can submit that as well. We also have our monarch calendar project, which is if you're collecting regular observations of monarchs, you can submit that here as well. And then just some other information about the app. You can create a profile with your information. There's good resources. So, if you're out in the field and you realize you don't remember, how to tell males and females apart, you can pull up the app, look, and then there's lots of other good resources. We've got videos on different aspects of the tagging process that Casey put together for us, and other great resources as well under the educational materials part. So if you are out tagging, thinking about males versus females, which is one of the pieces of information that we ask you to record, males have these pouches on their hind wings, these black dots. Females do not. And it's a little bit hard to see on the underside. This is the back side of the wings. But I always, kind of say it's like a Sharpie that bled through the paper to the other side. So this is a male here on the top and a female on the bottom. And then I threw a few more males in so you can kind of get more used to seeing them. But this one would be a male here, and then another male in this picture. And then thinking about proper tag placement, it goes in the center of the hind wing. We call this the discal cell, or more informally, the mitten-shaped cell. So you would place the tag there in the center. And it is one of those things where once you put the tag on, you got to go with it, even if it's, a little bit off, you can't reposition. So leave it as it is. Most of our tag recoveries are based on tags that are collected by the local communities in Mexico. We'll have volunteers that are visiting the overwintering sites that will buy the tags from those communities. But we do get pictures more frequently these days. So you can see one that we received for this past overwintering season, where you can see the picture that somebody took and identified the tagged monarch there as well. And then just as a point of interest, and we'll be developing a blog post once we're done. So we've kind of informally looked at the tags as the tags have changed a little bit over the years, and so we wanted to make sure there was good adhesion and whatnot. But we had some extra monarchs earlier a couple weeks ago, so we have some kind of walk-in person-sized cages out in the biohouse at our location in Lawrence. And so we have, one cage that's designed that has all female monarchs in there, half are tagged, half are untagged, as well as males. So this picture on the left, actually, I took this morning as I was checking the cages. And then I thought it was interesting. You can see, some of them are in better shape than others. They've all been in there for I think we're getting up to about 4 weeks now. But you can see, some of them have lost a lot of scales as they've aged, and you can see that the tag still adheres very well, but that you can also almost read the tag, or you actually can read the tag through the backside of the wing, which is pretty amazing. And then we had some rain earlier this week, and so it's kind of interesting. You can see how the monarchs are able to repel that rainwater. So just sharing a few observations. And then a little bit about our tagging recoveries. This is some previous analyses. There's some ongoing projects as well, looking at the recovery data. So instead of looking at it by latitude, we typically look at recoveries more by longitude. So thinking about more the different breeding regions of the country. So if we look at where we are in Kansas and Missouri, most of our tagging occurs in this region. So 40.9% of our tagging activity occurs in this region. So, again, from Minnesota down through Texas, and a majority of our recoveries occur in this region as well. So 67.5%. So a high area of monarch production, as well as tagging activity and recoveries. And then the lighter green area would be the second longitude range, where we have a good bit of tagging activity and recovery, and then farther east as well as west. And then this is just some images. So the video that I'm showing was from 2022 on the Oklahoma State University campus. A lot of the landscaping includes these abelia bushes, and this was one of the best years in terms of really high activity for monarchs in the Stillwater area. There were actually students stopping to take pictures. It was that noticeable, and so it was great for tagging, because you could just kind of gently flop your net and get several in your net at once. And so it was more of a limitation on how quickly could you process them than anything else, and then just kind of showing the differences in wing sizes, also body weight. So, how much they're fueling up for the migration and where as well. And then I wanted to make sure everybody knows about our two upcoming events. We've got our fall open house scheduled for September 14th. So that's a Saturday. And then the following Saturday is our tagging event. So I attended the tagging event last year, but this will be my first fall open house. So I'm looking forward to that. So if you are in the area and available to stop by for either event, information about the events are on our website. You can join us. And with that, I would be happy to address some questions from Lily.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Baum. We have a good amount of questions, and I will just start hitting you with them. I will try and synthesize a couple questions at once. So if audience members don't hear their exact question, just know I'm trying to get at multiple. But we had multiple questions about the variation that we see in especially monarch adults year to year. Some years seem like boom years. Some years we see very few. There's a couple people in the chat that reference seeing fewer than normal, especially this year. Can you just speak to why that may be? Yeah, what are your thoughts there?
And this was the second lowest overwintering population size on record. We were, I think we actually had really good news this spring, coming out of Texas. There was a lot of activity. So I think the population's doing better than we would have expected. But monarchs have the strategy that most insects have, which is you lay a lot of eggs. But few are going to survive, right? So if we think about out of every 100 eggs that a monarch may lay, a handful of those may make it to adulthood. But if you have higher survival, just a few more, especially that first generation, that's going to then create larger subsequent generations, you can see a pretty quick increase in the population size. So that's one of the reasons you see kind of peaks and lows and lots of differences in the population size. Again, it was a low year, but probably we're expecting to see more than we were expecting earlier this spring, given some of the good news coming out of that first generation. But yeah, it was a low year. And so, we may, the migration may be a little bit lower, but I think better than what we originally expected. So, and again, you may not have a lot of activity this year, but then hopefully next year or the year after, there are kind of shifts in terms of where the monarchs are each year and where you see the most activity. So definitely need more habitat, and ideally if we have enough habitat, then hopefully you'd see less, right? More habitat where they can be more spread out and have, less issues with parasites and predators and things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting considering the amount and what that might tell us, especially where we are in the range. We had some questions about discussing different points of the breeding range and seeing more or less, but also questions about the overwintering range, having that low year last year after decades of conservation effort and likely conservation progress. So can you also speak to differences in overwintering populations?
Yes, and again, I think one of the thoughts for why this year was so low was the drought conditions, and again, how extensive the drought conditions were, that they really covered the whole southern part of the migration route from southern Oklahoma all the way through to the overwintering sites. So again, if you've got at least some areas where they can recover and build up lipids, store up fats from nectar for the overwintering, then they can make up that difference in some cases. But this year, this past overwintering season, conditions were poor. So climate is a big challenge. Temperatures are a big challenge. Drought will continue to be a challenge in coming years as well. So so kind of big picture. And so I guess if we think about monarch way stations and providing habitat, thinking about selections that are going to do good, across that full range. I can also think of recent years where we've had hurricanes and, flooding in the spring. And, so you kind of need to be able to address all of those extremes more and more so. So thinking about that as you provide habitat. So, it may not be that important for a handful of years, but if you hit that one year where it really is, that can make a difference.
Yeah, you spoke specifically to, especially in these habitats, to have both milkweed for them to lay their eggs, but also about their having nectar plants to support them on each way of the journey. Would you say, we just had some questions of, is it maybe more important to focus on nectar resources for the migrants, or would you say for Missouri, is it important to focus on both ways? Is there a more focus on either, or is both really important?
So in this part of the country, definitely both. In some areas, you might have more activity in the spring, so you're focusing more on early milkweeds and nectar in the fall. But definitely for this region of the country, providing milkweed and nectar sources, both of those are really important.
Great.
And again, milkweed is a great nectar source, but just by the time fall migration comes around, most of it's past blooming.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, can you speak as well to monarchs as a pollinator? Sometimes people do monarchs pollinate milkweed? What kind of pollinators are they?
So monarchs are not the most effective pollinators. Butterflies in general tend to not be as effective. And you can even, they're not collecting pollen, so they're not, moving pollen as much. But they do transfer some pollen in different locations. For milkweeds have the pollen packets, the pollinia, and so that takes a different kind of transfer. So, and I'm trying to think if there's been research on the most effective pollinators for milkweed itself, but bees would be one that would be more effective. And again, if you kind of think about the design of the flowers and what that monarch or other butterflies look like when they're nectaring, you can kind of get an idea of what's effective. But yes, so not necessarily the most effective of pollinators, but they certainly play an important role in some situations more than others, and then a important species that kind of represents the overall pollinator community.
Absolutely. We spoke about tagging, and I think a lot of folks learned about how to properly tag and when and where, and we will send out resources with the recording of this talk so people can refer to that if they missed it in live. But we had some questions about how tagging or community efforts would be impacted if the monarch were to be listed as federally endangered or protected in some way federally. Do you have any thoughts about that, especially because it is a species with such large community involvement?
So that would depend on what stipulations were put in place. So if the monarch were threatened, there's the 4D rule where you define for each species, kind of what that looks like. So that would be one of the first questions many of us would be, what does that mean for rearing monarchs, community science, tagging, all of those things, and so. Certainly, if you look at the published research on monarchs, the community science aspect has contributed hugely to that. There's many publications that use data contributed by the community. So that has informed a lot of what we know about monarchs. But yeah, that would be a very important part of any listing decision would be finding out what's specified for those types of activities.
Mm-hmm. There is this big presence of the community in monarch conservation. A lot of it happens at home, even. We had some questions about is rearing monarchs at home in cages okay? Is that good? Is that helpful? What are your thoughts on that practice?
So rearing at home, we primarily view kind of more as a educational outreach type of activity, connecting people with nature. I certainly think the number of, adults that as kids were able to see the monarch life cycle. I mean, that's, such a valuable experience that I think shapes a lot of how people view, not only monarchs, but also, lots of other conservation related questions in terms of building up the population size or something like that. I would say, it's going to play less of a role. So it would be more important to focus on, rearing more for the educational outreach aspects. And I will say from the tagging data, we have the category on the data sheet where you list if it's reared or wild caught, and reared or recovered at a much lower rate than the wild caught. And so, certainly, and I will say from doing research on monarchs, right, they eat a lot. So, if they're out of food at any point in time, and, and we always did individual containers, so that would limit disease, and, you have to clean. I mean, it's a lot of work. So it's definitely challenging. So, to do it really well, especially, with lots of individuals, but yeah, I would say definitely, share with everybody you can to observe the life cycle and share that process. And we do have lots of our taggers that if they do rear, they'll tag their monarchs as well, which is great information for us too. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are similar questions about the home rearing and if there's any. Again, those are usually for educational purposes, but we had a question of if there's any differences in those in their ability to fly or, introducing them into the environment again. Do you have any worries about them? Also questions with parasites and parasitism in captivity.
Thinking about, monarchs and the migration, right? They rely on those environmental cues, to trigger the migration. And so, exposure to, natural light cycles and temperatures and all that's really important, right? For that fall migration. And there are some disease concerns, especially with Ophrya cystis electroscura, the OE, the spore-forming protist. And so, that's a challenge as well. And not only with home rearing, but also under other conditions. I know some of our data from Oklahoma when there were dry years, and so there was much less milkweed available, right? Monarchs might be more concentrated and smaller, less habitat to use for egg laying, so then you would expect OE levels to be higher. So it does have lots of challenges. There's some best practices that are posted, about how to deal with that. And I know a lot of people that do rear monarchs at home are very, careful to follow those, individual containers and sterilizing. And but again, it is a lot of work to do a really good job. So
Great. I have one question about the utilizing right-of-ways and roadsides as pollinator habitat. Is this helpful? Is this an area of good effort? What are your thoughts on those?
So, not all roadsides are created equal. So there's good locations that would probably be helpful. But, certainly some factors one would want to take into account. So certainly, wider roadsides. And then of course there's always the safety zone that will need to be mowed on a regular basis. But there have been some effective efforts for providing habitat. And again, I think it's like identifying through departments of transportation, what areas make sense, what areas don't make sense, and kind of focusing efforts. And I've done some research in Oklahoma on roadsides and habitat. Thinking about other pollinators as well. So yeah, definitely an area where I think there's been lots of commitment from a lot of transportation departments about how they can provide habitat in a way that balances all of those different needs.
Absolutely. Another area of expansion, is the backyard garden, and we have lots of questions about what species of milkweeds to plant, what is the survival rate of the milkweeds that you distribute. We will be sending resources with, the proper ecoregions, making sure you're sourcing the best milkweed for your area. But I was just wondering your thoughts, particularly on tropical milkweed. Or we got a couple points about tropical milkweed as well. So is that good or bad for the monarch? Are all milkweeds made equal? Are there any species that you see as being really successful in these plantings? Can you just speak to the milkweeds for a minute?
Well, I think the saying is always what right place, right plant, or maybe it's right plant, right place. I always like to add right person to the end of that. Because I think knowing what challenges there are with different species is really important, and it varies a lot, right? So I will say, so for example, having moved to Kansas and having a new home, I have some little flower beds in the front. So I have butterfly weed, tuberosa, and viridis, antelope horn milkweed planted in the front. And both of those, they're not going to spread via underground rhizomes. They're individual plants that grow from seed. And then in the back, I have common milkweed, syriaca, where I've got an area where, it would be great if it would, spread. I would be excited to have that. So I think it varies depending on what your needs and your interests are and what works for you. So certainly in terms of monarch preferences. We know they use, Aviridis a lot in the South Central region. I mean, they know Syriaca is really important for a huge chunk of their summer breeding range, or, almost all of it. And so, so it's great if you can plant those species, but if it doesn't work with what your setting is or what you need to be able to have, there's certainly other species that work great as well. If you have a wetter area, maybe you want swamp milkweed. So there's lots of different options. And then of course, I am not a waterer. I don't like to spend time watering. And so it's interesting. I know talking to a colleague of mine was talking about they had supported some school gardens, and so tuberosa butterfly milkweed not doing as well because they water a lot, right? So mine's doing great because I don't water, but so each species is a little bit different. So thinking about what the setting is and what that looks like, and so I think just doing your homework and finding something that fits your space is the best approach. You asked about tropical milkweed. So, we always promote natives. Tropical milkweed is a challenge in areas where it doesn't die back. So that would be along the Gulf Coast. And so the concern with that is that it will stay green very late in the year through the winter even. And then you'll have, monarchs. They're more temperature driven in terms of the migration. They're relying more on environmental cues, but if they and there are ones that will stay along the Gulf Coast during the winter. Some of them may be breeding, some of them may not. It varies depending on the conditions, but then the concern would be the OE spores would build up. So if you don't, so I think recommendations are to cut back the tropical milkweed plants, but other regions where it doesn't, it's not going to stay green year round. It would be more similar to other milkweeds. And if you, for example, live in an apartment and need a milkweed in a pot, that might be something that would work, where others might be more challenging for you. So and I will say there's other non-native milkweeds. So it's not necessarily just tropical, like Gomphocarpus would be one. So there are some other species that could have similar concerns, but that they're just less and less of a focus on those because they're less available commercially. But
Great, thank you. We have a couple questions about OE, and you mentioned OE and how its concentration can build up on a plant or in an area. Can you just describe it quickly to maybe someone who doesn't know what it is? Can you see it with your eyes? What does it look like, and how do we tell if they have it?
So OE is a spore-forming protist, and so when adults have been infected, they're infected at the larval stage. Their body will be externally covered with a bunch of these dormant spores. And so you cannot see them with the naked eye. You'd have to look at them under the microscope. Standard methods for sampling actually involve using a piece of tape or a clear mailing seal, so you can kind of press it against the underside of the abdomen of the monarch. It pulls off a few scales, and when you look at it under the microscope, if there's spores there, you can see those as well. I will say, thinking of, we've collected lots of late instars to look at parasitism, so fourths and fifths in the field. And I don't know that I've ever had any. We've had some that have emerged deformed, but they haven't had OE. So just because it's deformed doesn't mean it has OE. And I don't think any of our OE infected ones were deformed, but the concern is they don't fly as well or live as long. And then when the female lays eggs, she'll leave behind some spores on the egg casing, or potentially the plant. And then the first instar does when it hatches is it consumes that eggshell. So that's how the cycle continues. And was there more to the question? I may have lost the last part.
I can add a little bit more, which is that have in your tagging efforts, has OE monitoring ever been done at the same time? Or we have someone from the University of Georgia who mentions that they test for OE as part of tagging efforts. What
I
are your
do
thoughts on that?
personally. So
Mhm.
prior to joining Monarch Watch, we try to tag as many monarchs as we could. Usually, 1,000 plus in good years. But I have a whole process. I like to measure the length of the wing. So I want an idea of body size. And so then we'll also, and that picture I had a while back, I don't know if we can go back to that. The envelopes here, these are glassine envelopes. So they're little wax paper envelopes. So we would want to take them back to the lab. So we collect a bunch, but you want to process them quickly and get them on their way too, right? So it's kind of this big production. I think I've got my processing time down to less than 90 seconds per butterfly. But, so we catch them, bring them back to the lab, take them out. I think I measure the length and width of the wing. Most people just measure length, but I do width too. We'll then take we call it a tape count sample. That's the OE sample. We stick it on the paper, at the same time I'm zeroing my glassine envelope so I can then put the monarch in it and weigh it. And then I look at it under the microscope. And I do believe Sonia Altizer at the University of Georgia that runs Project Monarch Health. I think if you have a heavily infected one, they recommend freezing it. So I'll look at it under the microscope, and then by then my scale has gotten me a good measurement. I record the weight and then I tag it, and then we're on our way. So I personally do that, and that would be be great if people. I mean, it's a different data sheet per se for Project Monarch Health. And if anybody is actually interested in weighing and measuring, I would be interested in talking to them. So it's going to take longer, right? So you might not get to as many, but it's certainly valuable information. So I think it would be awesome to get all the information one can from all of your monarchs. But again, it does take a little longer. And if you've got more people helping or whatnot, it's definitely possible. So as you can see, I got excited by that. But yeah, but.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is exciting. It's exciting to think of how many people that can devote time and attention to the conservation of the species. It's exciting. There's one question that is about the pruning of milkweed, ahead of the fall migration in order to stimulate new, fresh growth for making sure there's not as much OE on that plant. There is research also with mowing milkweed in order to stimulate new growth. Can you share about that for people? And if you have any recommendations for folks in their own backyards?
Yes. And so one area that I think about that in particular, from my research in Oklahoma and kind of that region of the country. So we do have some monarchs that we don't necessarily know where they come from, but they move their south. So for and we'll just give the example of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri, they kind of, it kind of overlaps with the spring and summer breeding range. So you kind of get them more year round, but, or during the summer breeding throughout. But in Oklahoma, we would typically think, in Texas, we would think about having them in the spring. They move through, then they're typically farther north, right? So we're not going to see them again until you would traditionally think when they come through for the fall migration. But we actually have monarchs that move south early. I always say August 15th, which happens to be tomorrow. But that are reproducing. So these are reproductively active. When the monarchs are migrating in the fall, they're not reproductively active. So they're, different, so these are kind of more tattered and worn. And that's also, why, during the breeding season, they're going to live 2 to 6 weeks, right? But during the fall migrants are going to live from, August, September, all the way through to the following March and April. So anyway, because they're not investing energy in reproduction. But so then those monarchs, our milkweed, and again, I'll just give the example of Oklahoma and Texas because I know it well. The Asclepias viridis is our most commonly used milkweed. It typically sets seed. I always say around July 4th. Again, I'm generalizing greatly, but just related to different events. But then it's gone through its normal life cycle. So it's going to start to senesce and die back. So you typically aren't going to find much of it, when they're back in like mid-August and September. But if you mow or you have a summer prescribed fire, or if conditions are good in terms of rainfall that might trigger regrowth, or maybe milkweed that hasn't emerged in the spring to come up, then you will have tender regrowth. If you, for the summer prescribed fire, it'll actually, the viridis will bloom, so it's like one of the only things that's out there blooming in those plots. And then you'll have lots of activity. And there's also been a little bit of research, looking at mowing more in the summer breeding range. And again, if you mow, it's going to be that tender regrowth that they're gonna prefer. So, and for prescribed fire, we always talk about a lot of it about like patch burning, right? So if you're burning like a part of your area, 1 year, 1 season, part the next, right? You're not affecting the entire area, but you've always got like new growth or whatnot. But it would be, it's a little more challenging maybe with our traditional ways of mowing, but that would be another one where like maybe you can mow half. And so you've got, because you're going to be eliminating the resource at the time of mowing, for some length of time before it's going to regrow and then be available. But yes, tender regrowth is definitely one that is well known to be preferred by monarchs. So if one can provide that, but again, there's this trade-off, right? Because you'll have existing activity if you're in the summer breeding range. So how do you time it and make it work is a little challenging, but.
Absolutely. It's just a dance of all these different times and different phenologies of everything. So yeah, it's an incredible system. Can you speak a little bit to, I'll have this question, I'll do one more for you. But we had questions about what should we actively be removing threats for monarchs? Like say we have a caterpillar on a plant and we really want it to make it, but we see that there's threats in the area. Or, should we be actively removing predators or parasitoids or parasites in our gardens? Or do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I think, it's the overall community that functions to provide habitat for monarchs. So, certainly in your garden, and again, that's one where if we have more habitat out there, it's going to become, less of a challenge. But so that, and people do get disappointed when they see eggs and caterpillars and then they don't make it. But there's lots of different predators. But I think they're all part of the community that have lost habitat and that our monarch way stations or other types of habitat support. There's other caterpillars that feed on milkweed. Other thinking about milkweed bugs that use like the seed pods, and so there's a whole community that's associated with the milkweed plants as well. So I think if we can provide more and more habitat, the community is one that we would want to support as well. So I would rather just focus more on habitat in providing kind of that bigger picture. But and the predators go up and down as well, right? Like, so it's all kind of cyclic in different locations and, kind of different patches that have more or less activity over time. But when we have more and more habitat out there, then there's more patches of habitat for that to occur in. And so then we'd see more production of monarchs.
Great, awesome. We also had a couple questions of people just wondering what the best way to volunteer is, or, and we'll send all of this out, of course, for folks not live, but just to end with how people can help and how to get involved.
Well, and I think so generally for monarchs in general, there's so many opportunities and so many community science projects. So I think, and I think the Monarch Joint Venture, which I can look for that handout and send a link, has kind of a list of different community participatory science programs. So depending on what you're interested in, how much time you have, where you're at. So, so like Journey North, that's you just have to have a single observation that you submit. So it's probably, the least time commitment, but then, maybe the monarch larva monitoring project where you need to go out to your milkweed and monitor, once a week, that's going to be more time investment. So there's lots of different ways to contribute. But I think kind of broadening that out even more. So certainly from the Monarch Watch perspective, we focus on the habitat piece. We focus on tagging to support research, and we focus on education and sharing everything that you do, sharing with your neighbors, sharing with your family, getting more and more people involved. And I think that would apply to, to all of these projects as well as, maybe you've already created a way station and you've used up all the space that you can in your yard for that. And there's just, well, maybe you can help a school create a way station or a community center or, some other location, or maybe you've got some plants coming up that you need to move, so maybe you share, right? So there, I think there's lots of opportunities, and monarchs is definitely one where there's endless opportunities to participate in different ways to contribute, and all of them are beneficial. So there's hopefully something for everyone. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Carol finished us out. Lots of great feedback in that. Really great.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baum. Thank you, Lily. Yes, just wanted to provide some information in closing, and also would like to recognize that Monarch Watch is a valued member of the Missouri Prairie Foundation's Grow Native program. And Monarch Watch also was extremely helpful in our development of our Monarch Cafe plant tags that feature the life cycle of the monarch butterfly. And we created these to help consumers who are shopping, for instance, in a retail garden center, so they can make the connection between the critical need to plant native milkweed species. As mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded, and an email will be sent to you tomorrow with a link and other helpful resources. We have another butterfly event coming up, our annual dinner and silent auction this Saturday, August 17 in Columbia, Missouri. And our guest speaker will be Dr. Chris Barnhart, presenting on regal fritillary butterfly conservation. And we still have some tickets left. There, we will send a link to you in the email that goes out tomorrow. And you can also find the information on our website or social media right now as well, if you'd like. Our next webinar will be August 28th, a presentation by Julie Farstad as she shares how you can collect, store, and sow native seeds as we hold into the cold months ahead. And on September 28th, we're having a monarch tagging event of our own at an MPF prairie, and registration for this free event will be open September 10th. Thank you, Dr. Baum, very much for your excellent presentation and all the very important work that you do. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Everyone have a great evening.